Hello and welcome to Business Standard Dialogue. We are entering the fifth episode of this webinar series, and today's topic is cybersecurity in the time of Mythos. I'm Nivedita Mookerji, your host for the show. I am from Business Standard, and I'll introduce the panelists. It's a great panel we have here. We have Philippa Cogswell. She's managing partner JPAC Palo Alto Networks Unit 42. Welcome to the show, Philippa.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Pankit Desai from Securtech. He's co-founder and CEO of Securtech. Welcome to the show, Pankit.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
And we have Mr. Jayant from Checkpoint Software. He's Chief Information Security Officer for Asia Pacific and Japan. Welcome to the show, Jayant. And
thank you, Nivedita.
And finally, we have Aashish Aryan. He's my colleague from Business Standard, and he covers IT and AI, especially for the newspaper. Welcome to the show, everyone. And we'll begin with a general introduction to what you all do in these companies. So describe what your company does best in maintaining cybersecurity. We'll begin with Philippa. Just a brief introduction in one or two lines.
Yeah, will do. Thank you very much. So Philippa Cogswell, Vice President and Managing Partner for Unit 42 here at Palo Alto Networks. So Palo Alto Networks, as you're aware, is one of the world's largest cybersecurity companies. Traditionally starting out as a firewall company over 20 years ago, but really expanding into security operations, secure browsers, endpoint solutions, and so on. I lead our Unit 42 function. So that is our threat intelligence, incident response, and cyber consulting team at Palo Alto Networks.
Thank you. Pankit, if you can go next. Briefly about.
Thank you. Hi, I'm the co-founder CEO for Securtech. We are an enterprise cybersecurity company, have platforms predominantly in the area of defense and breadth, covering large part of the enterprise landscape, and really excited to be on this panel. Thank you.
Jen, just briefly about your company.
So Checkpoint has been almost 30 years in the industry. Prevention first led is our approach, largely into four broad pillars in 2026. Protecting the hybrid world environment, protecting the workforce, protecting the AI landscape, and also looking at the exposure management alignment. That I am part of CISO vertical in Checkpoint, 1 year with Checkpoint, but last 16 years I was with a global bank working as an APAC CISO alignment there.
Great. So coming back to you, Philippa, what is it about Anthropic's Claude Mythos that is so much of a talking point? What is so dangerous about Mythos?
Look, interesting question. And I would say that we've been having a lot of these conversations over the course of probably the last sort of 5 to 6 weeks. So just for context, back on the 7th of April, Anthropic announced Project Glasswing, which Palo Alto Networks was part of, along with 12 other companies. So we have had early access to Mythos Preview, and also through the Trusted Access or Cyber program, we've also had access to other frontier AI models. So similarly to the OpenAI, GPT, and others, right? So really what we've seen as part of that early access and the testing that we've been doing is a real sort of step change, I think you would say, in terms of its capability, right? So there's been a lot of discussion around its ability to find vulnerabilities and exploit those, which is very, very true, and one of our key findings as part of our testing. But also chaining together some of the lower severity vulnerabilities as well, and developing, viable attack paths like we haven't seen before. We've been speaking quite a lot about the context reasoning abilities of these models as well, and you can certainly see that, the ability to identify weaknesses and misconfigurations in environments, and bringing together the broader context, right? So potentially things like leaked credentials or misconfigurations, exposed APIs. And really expanding the attack surface beyond what we've seen previously. They're probably some of the leading things that we've seen in terms of our testing. And look, we've sort of summarized it recently with, we sort of believe that what we saw and what we were able to achieve in sort of 3 weeks of model-assisted testing were probably the equivalent of what we were seeing with our pen testers over a year or more previously. So you can sort of see, what we were previously finding versus what we're finding with these models is certainly rapidly enhanced.
Right. You've spoken about speed being the most worrying feature here. So I was listening to one of your interviews, and you did mention speed. What is it that we can do about it? What is it? Is there a solution?
Well, I think it's not just speed alone. Speed is obviously concerning because if you think about the end-to-end of an attack, it certainly is increasing that significantly. But it's also the scale at which we're going to see vulnerabilities being exploited that I think is also quite alarming, and also the efficacy of attacks as well. So they're going to make attacks far more efficient. And interestingly, these are some of the things that we actually discussed coming out of our 2026 incident response report that we released in February as well. We'd already started to see how AI was sort of really enabling attacks, but now when we're looking at these sort of models, we're almost flipping to sort of see them as being more AI driven. So the reality is when we're facing into something like this, we definitely need to be looking more at AI enabled defenses effectively as well. We can't assume that attackers have the advantage. We should be also applying these from a defensive security standpoint as well.
Right. Pankit, coming to you, why was a startup set up? Why did you think of a startup in this space after being in the IT sector for so long? What was the trigger?
I guess a couple of things. So when we stepped out of our corporate worlds in 2013, we were seeing, specifically more from a partner than myself, we came from Symantec. We felt that the larger enterprises were getting supported extremely well by technology and resources from large OEMs, but the mid-market was somehow getting left out. And we found a white space where we could look at combining several different capabilities together and offer it as a package that made sense for mid-market. So today, about 300 customers that we have. So while we have some extremely large banks and manufacturing companies as our customers, but large part, about 75% of our customers are in the mid-market. These are the same companies that need enormous amount of help from a security standpoint, but really struggle to understand what it means for them in terms of where do they source resources from, how do they make it work in their environment. And more often than not, it tends to be an afterthought in terms of how they address the challenges. So we kind of came up with an approach of product, platform, and people, stitching together several different capabilities to make life easy for our customer. And I think Philippa spoke about what Mythos does in terms of stitching together several low-intensity vulnerabilities to create an attack. Our platforms were geared from day one to look at capabilities that fly under the radar. As I always say, security unfortunately works on threshold and above. Anything below threshold you tend to ignore because there's only so much you can manage. But what AI does is that below threshold activities can be combined together to really create a disproportionate impact. That's the area that we started working on, seems to be only finding resonance in the market right now.
Jayant, there was an IMF report recently and which warned about AI-powered cyber attacks and how these can endanger financial stability. Do you agree, and to what extent, and how serious is that?
So first thing, it is serious. It is something which has to be taken into considerations. All the AI models currently we are looking at, including Mythos, is not that something they are creating new attack surface or new vulnerabilities out there. The point here is that it is now exposing the existing vulnerabilities much more faster. And that's where, we have seen the tier one banks coming across and making those statements, because the fact of the life is that, in fact, last 10 years, Nivedita, I was sitting with RBI for a couple of discussions, and one of the KI which I see, which is always read in front of regulators, it is VTMs, vulnerability and threat management. Now, when you keep on doing consistent patching, you have the legacy environment out there, tech stack, which is vulnerable in the environment. So the global banks, largely in the FSI verticals, the scale of the threat is that it is not something which was unknown. It was known. Now it is being amplified much more faster at that scale. So, but the point here is that between signal and noise, there's a fact fine line difference there. And that's why I would say that currently, when we are looking at entire ecosystem, when the model was released, Mythos was released, it's very closed model at this point of time. It is not exposed larger to the public domains there. And fundamental reason is that the true shift left is happening now. We are talking about CI/CD pipelines, DevSecOps, making sure those patches gets aligned very fast. Business was accepting that risk, living with that risk for 30 days, 45 days, or more than that. Now it's not a time that it can be for 30 days. It has to be within 24 hours or 48 hours in that time frame. So that's where the larger risk lies, that there is in fact it is serious alignment there. And what I'm particularly impressed is that those risks are now getting surfaced much more faster, and businesses are making decisions much faster. Initially, they wanted to sit on top of it and say, okay, I want to live with legacy tech stack. Let me see what's going to happen, that alignment there.
Right. You mentioned RBI and sitting with RBI on similar issues. But, according to the IMF report, they have suggested that coordinated regulatory standards among countries should be formed. So, where is RBI there? Do you have any inkling on that, on the governance and regulatory side?
So again, RBI regulations are very mature. I can say that it has evolved over a period of time. Last 10 years, when I see the drive was about digitalizations, right? Now in 2026, 2020, or until 2030, when you look at, is more about governance, board commitments, alignment there. So broadly from Asia perspective, regulator collaboration and harmonization is happening. FSI slightly stands much more at the mature level in that alignment there, whether it's collaboration with regulators in APRA in Australia, MS in Singapore, SBV in Vietnam. That collaboration is out there. RBI has conducted various cyber threat exercises. And it is not kind of the paper-based exercises, tabletop exercises. It's live inject coming into play. So that maturity level is within the FSI vertical is definitely elevating. But the point here, which Pankit was highlighting, is that slightly you go outside of banking sectors, which is very heavily regulated, you will find larger issues and larger risks there. And that's where the gap of fine balance comes into play.
Okay. Ashish, you are covering this sector closely, and you know what ministers have been saying, bureaucrats have been talking about it, quite regularly, and they want to keep a close watch from the Indian government.
Right, Nivedita, absolutely. So the government response that has been far, particularly on the of Mythos, of caution, but at the time they want to move at speed and with LRCT and with clear focus that this is threat that is sort of determined to undermine the entire structures of our banks, financial systems, etc. And therefore, we must, while maintaining that caution, proceed speed, which ensures that the hard-earned money or wealth of people that is accumulated does not go away. The response, like you rightly said, it has been from FinMin, it has been from RBI. METI has been regularly meeting all these stakeholders, and METI came out with detailed guidelines for larger companies, for MSMEs on what they should do, explaining in very clear detail on what is it that AI or general purpose technologies like Mythos, how they should avoid it, or what are the various do's and don'ts that they should regularly adopt. So definitely the response that the government has been taking this time around is one where they understand the threat that comes with a general purpose technology like Mythos, but at the same time ensuring that the trigger does not really spread out to everyone.
Okay, Ashish, we'll come back to you in a bit. Philippa, from the Indian standpoint, do you see a bigger worry in terms of cybersecurity when compared to other countries?
I wouldn't hone in on India specifically, no, and I think it sort of was touched on a little bit by Jayant's comments as well, right? You've got different industries that are potentially more mature than others based on how they've been regulated for extended periods of time. You mentioned APRA very briefly, which is, the Australian regulator for financial services. They take a threat-led vulnerability risk management approach, and those organizations that tend to take that level of approach tend to be more resilient. I wouldn't say it's necessarily on a country-by-country basis. We do see some variation, but I wouldn't say it's that alarming. And I would say that, obviously there is a lot of conversations that I'm a part of in India. There is a lot of conversation at a government level, a lot of conversation in industry. It's like everywhere, a lot of this comes from, industry awareness to begin with. It also comes from regulatory environments and sort of that top-down approach to security, and and even also the application of AI and what have you for the betterment of security practices.
What are your thoughts on coordinated regulatory approach? Who is really taking the lead there?
Again, I think that actually depends on which regulatory environment you're talking about and which industry it's applying to. So again, if I look at general sort of themes across the region, I would sort of say that there's certainly countries that have led very early. Financial services industry, as we have mentioned, has certainly been led. They've been regulated for an extended period of time. But as we look globally or even in our region, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of governments that have come out with new regulation, particularly around critical infrastructure, privacy, AI, a lot of them which are adjacent to cybersecurity as a whole, right? So I think we're definitely seeing a change in pace around the theatre or around the region in that context. But those that are regulated do tend to be paying more attention because they need to be somewhat more accountable and need to report. And it's that old age saying of those things that we monitor and we look at actually get attention, right? And I think that is probably in some ways the good news for cyber when it does become regulated. But equally in this particular context and the context of something like Mythos, I've been in the industry going on 25 years now myself, and I'd say to me this is a dramatic change that it doesn't matter almost in some cases what regulation says. There is a sort of a vulnerability deluge, if you will, coming for organizations, and organizations, we have a small window in which to prepare. And I think it's in best interest for everybody to be thinking about how do we prepare, how do we protect the organizations, the, sensitive information they're holding and the critical services that they're providing to, be it, citizens or the public or their members or whomever.
So Nivedita, just to build on Philippa's point, right? So on the regulations perspective, again, as I mentioned, that India has regulations in play last 10 years. Currently, CERT-In has a short period of reporting timeline. Six hours of reporting timeline is out there. Now, slightly when I look at only AI specific regulations, data privacy, other regulations are alignment there. But slightly when you're asking question is that who is leading and where the maturity gaps lies across is that when I look at markets in Asia like Australia and MAS regulators have become outcome based driven, right? It is not about enforcing, it is more about outcome based where they can help the sectors who are weak, right? Where the enforcement can happen. It's not just about enforcing the regulations because the speed is moving so fast. Regulators are learning journey alignment there. The sectors which are vulnerable needs a regulator defense alignment there. And that's where I would say that slightly the lagging part is coming across. Once you look at your cybersecurity laws, data privacy laws, AI regulations, all harmonization coming across, then you spread a broader framework across the industries which are vulnerable and make them more enable outcome based driven rather than enforcement based driven. You will see the more standards getting applied there. One of the regulations which I was closely working in Asia was also that regulators is now looking at enforcement of the models which will be adopted in critical infrastructures. So it's not just open source model. You cannot just go and buy open source model and deploy it because they are worried is that the models which are industry standard are regulated, governed, trustworthy, responsible. They know what is happening. Now, the sectors which are going to adopt open source models specifically for critical infrastructures becomes an issue. So slightly, I would say that I have not seen those kind of regulations around models coming in. Yeah, I'm sure they're in draft phase. It is evolved over a period of time. But that's where I think the areas of focus will be required to be done.
Jayant, you recently said somewhere that cyber leaders should think like business leaders. What exactly did you mean by that?
So this is very important construct out there. An example as a CISO, like again, I was sitting on the customer side of the house. When you are going to the board, when you want to ask for the money for vulnerabilities, right? VTMs, you have a couple of vulnerabilities out there. You look at online banking platform, right? Example, just to name across. Now there's a critical vulnerability or online banking platform. You have to patch it fast. You are going to ask business for certain amount of investments, time, money, or resources, right? Can you translate that into business language? So example, an online banking platform being down for 4 hours, what is a tangible customer impact? What will be the business loss in the dollar terms? So your CFO, your CRO, they understand the language of like reputational risk, right? Business impact risk, fraud risk. Those are the risks, the language they understand. When you just say a tech risk or cyber risk, that language becomes very flat. And I would say that the awareness is definitely going up. Now, this cybersecurity debates is happening in parliaments also there. But as a cyber defenders, we need to play a role to translate this risk into business risk language so you get the right investments out there. Right? That's extremely crucial to understand the business dynamics rather than the tech dynamics. I would say that both is important in that current context.
Okay. Pankit, shortage of skilled professionals that has been talked about earlier also. Do you think it's a big issue in this sphere?
So it's going both ways, right? With AI, skills themselves are a problem in the sense whether you need skills or not. I think the question probably would be, do you have the skills that can critically leverage AI to make your defenses better versus raw skills? So this would probably in the realm of validation that you need skill sets around, which means people who've been there, done that, have been exposed to real life situations have. So let's say, let's look at this whole Mythos story. And there is a nice writer's article that has just come yesterday. I guess for the audience, you can have a look at it. But there is this whole thesis around that probably there is, yeah, while the Mythos threat is real, there is a little bit of overstatement of what it can do at this point of time, because a lot of outcomes that were delivered by practitioners helping it navigate, harness, asking a very complicated, for lack of a better word, prompts to be able to carry out the attack in the way it actually ended up getting carried out. So there is a little bit of a threshold that one has to still work on. It was not a weak algorithm with entry-level people using it to exploit vulnerabilities. You really needed a certain set of skill sets to really pull what it ended up actually happening, right? The outcomes will come from AI. There has to be now a capability to respond in that fashion with that speed. That's something that needs to be worked upon. So yes, you will need skills to work towards that. There is this whole issue around the entry-level skill sets and what it will mean right now in the AI world, whether the original growth engine for India from a tech services standpoint, where hundreds of thousands of kids would get absorbed in the curriculum, from the curriculum into the industry. Now that is undergoing a sea change. The demand will now be from the kids coming out is the ability to literally leapfrog within that 4-year program, a level of skill set that makes them leverage and understand AI effectively when they are being used in practical scenarios. One point I think you had asked, Philippa, I just wanted to kind of sum it up in terms of what you see as a risk in India. I think the fundamental risk that I see is that the pace of technology adoption in India is significantly higher and faster than any country in recent memory, right? In the last 10 years, if you say post demonetization, if you were to look at the last 10 years from 2016 to 26 onwards, across industries, whether you're talking about the financial services or education or government or health tech, you absorb technology significantly faster. A lot of it was possible because of the startup ecosystem and a lot of tech that got assimilated and delivered to enterprises because the legacy companies weren't in a position to absorb technology or create technology for themselves. And therefore, you have an extended value system that is delivering outcomes at scale for customers. Now, a lot of those technologies that got built were on back of open source or capabilities that were meant to deliver quick MVPs. How ready are they in terms of being able to respond to a threat that is going to be exposed by an AI is a question. When you have an industry scale product that has been around for 20, 30 years, it has gone through a certain rigor over a period of time. I'm not to say that startups will not have done it, but generally speaking, that story hasn't been very encouraging for us in terms of being able to spend money behind building industry scale secured products. Now, that's something that will have to happen. Otherwise, it will be like your security is as good as your weakest link, and that could potentially be a weakest link. And I think, regulators already talking about it. RBI has been on the front asking banks to figure out what the outsourced partners are doing, the typical supply chain risk conversation. This AI element will have to be get added to it.
Correct. Aashish, you had a question for our panelists. Will you ask the question?
Yeah. Thank you, Nivedita. So, Philippa mentioned, Jayant mentioned that the first responders, so to say, to this threat of Mythos have been the financial services companies, and like Pankit said, that the rate of adoption of technology in India is much faster compared to any other country in the world. Keeping that in context, what do you think should be an ideal regulator then? Should it be the finance ministry? Should it be the RBI? In context of India, generally, or should it be MeitY because MeitY is about all things internet? Where does the really, the governance responsibility lie? We can start with maybe Philippa and then Jayant and Pankit can.
Philippa, would you like to take that question?
So where should the response lie, I think was the question with regards to which regulator. I would definitely defer to those, particularly who's come from, a regulatory environment himself inside of India. But look, I think, if I look at regulatory environments in other parts of the region, they are, like I said earlier, they're regulated across different industries, right? Typically speaking, there's no one size fits all. I think, if I look to the way that we're describing sort of India in terms of its very recent, large scale digital growth and digital adoption, I think this is, in the context of this conversation, in the context of Mythos, this is a good conversation to have, right? Because we're now saying that we've got these models that not only help identify vulnerabilities, but really the half glass full part of this conversation should actually be about how do we then use such models to actually ensure that when you're building these capabilities, homegrown or otherwise, you're actually building secure code to begin with. So when you're implementing, whether you're a startup or otherwise, you're actually implementing better systems in the first place, right? Now, I know that doesn't answer the regulation question, but I think there was a number of different ways and different comments sort of built up in some of those other sort of responses there.
Pankit?
Yeah, so it has to come from the government at an orchestrated level. But I just saw a week or 10 days back, SEBI came out with a fairly reasonable guideline around what the impact. In fact, it was in the context of Mythos. What they did, what I liked is every single constituent agency of SEBI, which basically means the MIIs and the depositories and stock brokers and exchanges and funds, everyone, it has been sent to everyone. And they have done a very good job of at least helping the constituents understand what the problem statement is all about, given reasonably decent steps that they can action on in terms of what is it that they have to look at in their extended ecosystem, what specific line items they need to work on from a vulnerability VM program or a SOC or skill set or training. So I think they have taken the step first. And I think I'm very surprised because normally RBI in India has been the lead in terms of going out in the market. Now, RBI has had consultations with the top 15 banks that I know of, and they're now going down the chain. But SEBI was first off the gate with a documented approach to it. I guess the others will follow. And likewise, it has to come from the financial services industry because they have always taken the lead in terms of the security side of the house, then followed by TRAI and NHBs and the NCI, PCs, the other agencies that typically control the regulation in the country.
Jayant, any thoughts there?
I have a slightly different answer. right? So I have seen different regulations alignment. If I look at 4 layers of the regulations, generally coming from the accountability perspective, the first layer is the Prime Minister's office, right? That's where the construct starts with about the governance alignment there. Then you have a national level cybersecurity agencies, right? At the national level. From there, you have sector regulators. That is third layer. Sector regulators can be finance, manufacturing, energy, healthcare, alignment. That's a third layer. And the fourth layer you have is your independent body. Sometimes, if you have in for financial industries, you use FSI, SECs, and other alignments there. So there are broadly 4 layers there. Now, when I look at where the governance sits across, India has done a tremendous job last 10 years. As I mentioned, is there are 4 yugas from digitalizations to safety. We have came a long way. The shift of cybersecurity has moved from cybersecurity to digital safety. So that has already been in the play. So in my view is that let's not just say that this or this is more about that. When I look at largely, there are 3 layers. So first thing is that like Mythos case, right? There's a partnership between AI labs and the industry, right? That's a close partnership that we will do this things alignment. That is the first thing to do that right thing. The second thing, which example is more about also getting into equations. Like the example was that Checkpoint and Google partnership alignment, that collaboration within the tech industry just to make sure cyber defense is strong. The third one is then public-private partnership, very important. RBI has taken a stand, CERTIN has taken a stand, SBI has, CB has decided the task force for the AI, that is very important. And on top of that, there are very open public source forums out there and where the communication FSI sec those channels are happening alignment there. At the end of the day, if I'm leading a bank or any of the sector, the board is accountable, responsible for it. And I would say that if you are managing any of the critical infrastructure, don't wait for regulations to evolve. There are solid frameworks out there. As a defender, as a board member, you must leverage. Ultimately, end of the day, when things goes wrong, you cannot say the regulator did not guided me. I did not have any tools or technology. Ultimately, you are liable and responsible to your stakeholders. It remains with the board for that organizations. Tools are out there, technologies are out there, regulations are out there. People are there to collaborate and support you. It goes across different layers.
Right.
And
Important points.
Yes,
We
thank you
have
very much.
we have lots of audience questions coming in, so we'll take a few. We are sort of running out of time. We'll start with a question from Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, who's the editorial director of Business Standard. His question is, has the Mythos movement undermined the idea of making artificial intelligence a public infrastructure project?
I don't think so. I think Mythos per se, see, it is not that it is finding things that did not exist before. The vulnerabilities did exist, right? The problems did exist. They are just coming out faster. So it's sometimes saying that, hey, you got a new technology and the new technology is finding problems and therefore the technology is bad. I think probably it's a slightly overly pessimistic construct, if I may. Yeah, there is a problem. If there was no problem, it would not have found any problem, right? And it is the other part is it is being able to stitch together several low-level problems to be able to carry out something which anyway a smart red teamer is supposed to do. That's what a red team exercise was, that humans were doing it. Now it is obviously at an industrial scale. AI is here to stay. AI has a lot of good in it. I personally feel that capabilities like Mythos or Daybreak or M- from Microsoft will allow us to build secure capabilities from day one. We ran amok sometimes from an AI perspective, building AI tools and technologies and capabilities in the market space, probably not thinking about the security angle of it. With the shift left that I think Jayant spoke about, allows us to build AI models and capabilities at scale, along with ensuring that the underlying security threats are also addressed before they become mass scale.
So Nivedita, if I can just add one point on the top of that,
Yes.
It's not a public weapon, right? So the fundamentals plays a very important part. What Mythos is doing is that taking us to fix that architecture from the core. so you don't land into situations now? I don't think so. Means I was trying to interpret the question that it is going to become a public weapon. No, it's not going to become like that. And my means Anthropic and the leaders have played a very tactical strategic approach to make it close in the environment, because they don't want this tool to be out in the public domain at this point of time.
Thank you. Next question is from Manisha Ghole. The question is, are the existing banking systems resilient to Mythos? And what about mobile apps and wallets?
This is a very interesting question, and I can just take it because I come from 16 years from the banking industry alignment there. Short answer is, I would say that no. I mean, slightly I'm saying from the experience perspective, because you look at the world of banking platforms is currently hybrid. There's a still legacy tech stack out there, right? Why the big leaders make this statement is underlying reasons behind it. So they need to get rid of that legacy environment, move towards the latest and greatest environment out there. So if you say that, was it resilient? Yes. So from the resiliency perspectives, environment gets aligned there. Now the question is that how fast a bank has appetite to patch it. Many banks in India have allocated funding, 10% or 20% fundings out there. It was in public domains alignment there. Why those fundings are coming across now is that this was again a board level conversation earlier, but it was not a priority level conversations. Anthropic Mythos makes the priority level conversations to make it much more resilient, more robust in that alignment there.
Thanks. Sameer Bhardwaj is asking, how can civil society also contribute in cyber security?
How can civil society also contribute? Look, I think we've discussed it for many, many years. The reality is with cybersecurity, it is a sort of a team sport, if you will do, right? The reality is, I think when it comes to an individual versus an organization on how you secure it, yes, there is differences. But I think really where I sit in educating, be it major organizations, the way that we sort of look at that when we're doing it, it's not just about an organization securing that organization and its employees, but it's how that has an effect that goes out into the community as well, and how that awareness actually blends through. When we talk about patching, it's not just our computers at home, but it's also our mobile devices that we use, or home routers and things like that as well, right? So it's about that general awareness. And, again, I think the more that we're discussing cyber in the public domain, the more we're sort of getting that that sort of awareness out there. But it's really about people also being aware of what are the impacts of getting it wrong. I think we heard a little bit before from an organizational level when we talk about financial impacts with systems being offline and productivity outages and these sorts of things. But I think there's some real world implications when we start talking about individuals, and not just as home users, but even as individuals who have had their data stolen as part of a larger breach or something like that. I've seen some unfortunate situations where it's really, really impacted individuals around identity theft and things like that as well. And these can be ongoing things. So again, I think everything we can be doing to, whether it's government communications out, whether it's about how we're training from an organizational level and upskilling, whether it be in schools early on and not just later in university, about the general sort of education, and that therefore how can we all sort of contribute? It really is a team sport, I think, when it comes to cybersecurity. I think there's a lot that we can be doing in the industry collaboratively. I heard it before, the public-private partnerships, how we think about governments working with organizations like ours. I think, there's been a big realization. Previously, government did a lot in this, understanding the threat actor space, but as times evolved, really understanding how research arms and incident response teams like ours actually have this, really great depth and breadth that we can bring to, that broader understanding about threats. Because if you don't understand the threats, the reality is you can't secure them, right? Secure yourself from them. So I think there's a lot in that space that we can be doing, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much. We have many more questions, but I have time only for one last question now. This is from my colleague in Mumbai who covers the finance world with technology as his specialty. So Ajinkya Kawale is asking, how can Indian companies cope with the dangers of Mythos?
So first thing, I would just take this as a stab, Nivedita, right? So first thing is that shift left. look at the fundamentals, right? I would say, I mean, again, in today's topics, Nivedita, we were discussing earlier was about AI governance, was that understand AI safety, AI security, AI governance are three different verticals there, right? Make sure that entire, if you are from bank, example, if this question is from the FSI vertical, shift left, the architecture is the blueprint. We are talking about zero trust for quite some time, right? It's not that something we are going talking zero trust now. Look at zero trust. Philippa mentioned about identities. Now it is more about vulnerabilities coming into play. If you do things right, critical infrastructures. I'm not going to say that you have to boil the oceans. Look at your critical applications, tech stacks, segment, segment, segment. Make sure you reduce your attack surface so you don't land into situations where your critical infrastructure is impacted. I have personally seen collateral damages. Sometimes the critical application sits with a non-critical application. The target is non-critical applications, but there's a collateral damage alignment there. So architecture is fundamental. Once you do that right, identity is right, governance right, safety, security alignment there, that will be the first thing to coming into play. And then you look at broader exposure management, right? Once you have prevention-led approach, then you go to the exposure management side of the house. In exposure management, there are three things very crucial. Making sure you have right visibility. That's first thing. Second part is more about when you are looking at visibility, you need to prioritize those attacks or penetrations or patching alignment there. And do the safe remediations. Tactical safe remediation is going to be a crucial alignment there. Once you do this, all things is right, I would say that you will be in a good shape. And I think one of the slightly long answer, Nivedita, sorry for that, but I saw the UK's one of the AI-based security research publications out there. What they advertise is that Mythos was not able to crack if you're going to do governance well. If you're going to well systems patch, if your architecture is right, if your fundamentals are strong, it's hard. Make the life hard for the attackers, right? Don't give them easy wins out there.
I'd
Very
actually
important.
agree with,
Yeah.
I'd agree with a lot of the statements just made there. The one thing I would say is the models that we're seeing today, as advanced as they are comparatively to what we've seen previously, they are the most basic that we are going to now see going forward. So we're only going to see advancements on top of these, right? We're only going to see greater capability. So we've got to sort of, if we think back to previous versions and how quickly they've evolved, I can only assume we're going to see quick evolvement once again. To your point, I would absolutely focus in on, using models like this. And this is what we're doing as part of our services now as well, right? Using, commercially available models to actually test and identify these exposures, right? We need to be helping organizations to find what these are if they're unable to do it for themselves, or even we've spoken a lot about banking in this conversation. I've even got banks coming to us saying, yes, we're doing programs exactly like what you've described, but we want you doing it as well, so we can almost compare and contrast. We also spoke about the idea of putting, humans alongside doing this. That's exactly what we're doing. We're putting one of our red team alongside to sort of validate some of those paths and validate some of the findings. I'm going to expect with every model and every iteration and every environment, we're finding different things. Again, the more context you give these things, the more powerful they're going to become, right? So we really need to be focused in on it. And it loops right back to conversations around even regulatory environments. I've seen some of the shifts really focusing on things about, the exposures, reducing that external attacks surface and things like that, right? There's a lot of organizations out there that still do not understand what that looks like, right? So it's, effectively finding and fixing these things before attackers can get to them first, understanding what that external exposure looks like, using technologies that match with the AI speed, basically using AI-driven technologies themselves. We've spoken about, in this conversation, we've spoken about, skills shortages and the shift of skills and things like that. Again, we've got to be matching it. We've got to get to real-time security operations, because these things, are acting extremely fast now and will only be acting even faster in the short term.
So Philippa, your last words, do you think, are you optimistic that there will be solutions, effective solutions to beat Mythos at its game?
Absolutely. We've spoken about it quite a bit on here. I heard the term platform described earlier on. That's exactly what we've been doing at Palo Alto Networks, right? Which is building end-to-end solution for a platform, because a lot of what we've found in our incident response cases is a lack of visibility, too much complexity environments and things like this. And this only amplifies it much, much more greatly. Like I do believe we've got probably a period of, I'd hate to say it, but short-term pain where we're going to have vulnerability deluges. We're going to see a spike of incidents, but I'd like to think that this is probably the first time really I think we also have an equal advantage to be using these technologies from a defensive security standpoint as well, building more secure code, everything from ground up. I think, hopefully we'll see a shift. There's a lot of people in this industry who have been working very hard for a very long time. I hope that we get to see, some added benefit and some gain from what we're experiencing now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it was a wonderful conversation. We've come to the end of the show. There are so many takeaways on what's happening now, so much happening on technology. And we are hopeful that the solution is there. We just have to work harder. And see you all next week with another great conversation on an exciting subject in Business Standard Dialogue. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.